Jaime, you've talked about the value of making change overnight. I've heard you tell stories about that. Has that continued? I mean, did you set a culture? Did you set a way of doing things that was then repeated after you left?
Things are getting, we're having more and more bureaucracy. But I still believe that you can make an important change in a city in less than 3 years. No matter the scale, no matter the financial conditions, all you have to build, it's a good equation of co-responsibility. For instance, we didn't have the money to buy a complete new fleet for public transport. It's $300 million. So what was the equation? The city, we made this equation. We called the private sector, we told them, we're going to build the itinerary. You're going to buy the fleet. And we are going to pay you by kilometer. That's it. They invested, and it works for more than 45 years. So, another example is not only by and we starting is important. We started with 50,000 passengers a day. And this system is being improved and improved and improved. Now it's transporting 2,800,000 passengers a day. Wow. The subway in London is transporting 3 million. And London is a much bigger city, the oldest subway system. So I remember when I was a governor, we had to clean our base. So in Rio, they got a loan from the World Bank, $800 million. We didn't have that loan. So what was the equation of co-responsibility? To clean our base, or to start to clean. And a co-responsibility with the fishermen. So we told them, if you catch the fish, it's yours. If you catch garbage, we're going to buy. If the day is not good for fishing, you're going to fish garbage, and we'll pay. The more garbage they catch, the fish, the cleaner the bay become. The cleaner the bay is, more fish they'll have. It's a win-win solution. I'm not saying everything is work, but we started. And starting is a very important point, because we cannot have all the answers. We cannot be so prepotent, and we cannot wait to have all the answers. Innovation is starting. This is very important. Creativity is starting. So, and sometimes too much money interferes. If you want creativity, cut 1 0 from your budget. If you want sustainability, cut 2 zeros from your budget. And I can give you many examples. And if you want solidarity, assume your identity and respect others' diversity. Well, I'm saying that sometimes people are making from the problems of a city a so complex issue. A city is not so complex that the complexity sellers want us to understand them. And the world is full of complexity sellers. And we should beat them by slippers. Speaking about bureaucracy, it's possible to swim inside the bureaucracy. When I was a mayor, we did a theater in 2 months, legally, with all the bureaucracy. What was the way how to do it? I'm sure in housing, in everything, you can make it. You can make it. We designed with only one material. One material, and we made a bid for this material and one bid for the manpower. In 2 months, the theater was finished. So, planning or organizing a good equation of co-responsibility. I'll give you the example of housing. All the time the government wants to have all the money. It's not necessary. What the federal government should say is, we're going to provide for each house that amount of money. The city level can participate with another amount, and the citizen another. So it's always, you don't have to have the whole money. I realized one thing. Here in the US, you're privatizing the streets for the cars. And at the same time, public transport, it's not privatized. So it's always subsidized, always subsidized. And you need more money to subsidize other important issues. So always is the way how you organize a good equation. But mostly don't pay attention to bureaucracy. I'll give you an example. When I started to work as a mayor, I was very young at that time. My staff was very young, very committed. So, and we had good professionals in the city, but they were not committed with change. So I organized what I called a cemetery of elephants. So they were in charge of everything that deals with bureaucracy. And I put my staff to do it. At the end of 2 months, when they finished their bureaucracy, I threw it away. Keep them busy with, if not to interfere. So I'm really very anxious about how much it's complicated. And I like the idea that they proposed, that the initiative, we can take the initiative. Or building our houses, or it's not, I didn't spend 1 minute in the Brasilia, in the capital, when I was a mayor. I don't want your money, I don't want your interference. We'll organize another way.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems like that's a theme on this panel. The co-responsibility notion, it seems to me, is fundamental to what you're thinking of doing, right? I mean, that the homeowners themselves, those will have a role in making those homes. I mean, is that what you anticipate?
Yeah, absolutely.
Can you talk a little bit about it? I think it's fascinating. Andreas they're sharing notes here. That's good. I think you're providing new language for lean urbanism. This is good. Cemetery of elephants. I saw you write that down.
Methods, these are methods.
Yeah, methods. But Alejandro, could you talk about how you operationalize this idea of co-responsibility?
Well, I would say it starts by treating people like adults. And by that, I mean, let me start with a very concrete story about the social housing thing, because money could pay, we said, okay, we would like to improve the quality of social housing. Slightly back again. I started because of the meeting with an engineer at Harvard. He was studying Chilean engineer at the Kennedy School of Government. And when we met, I said, what are you doing here? Well, I was invited to teach. Really? So yeah, because I heard that Chilean architecture is doing so well and is being internationally recognized, that you begin to grow and feel really cool. Yeah, Chilean architecture is doing fine. And then he said, if Chilean architecture is so good, why is social housing so bad? And that's 60% of what's being built in the country. So it's feeling of self-embarrassment kind of invades you. So he said, why don't we do something regarding this? For me as an architect, do something meant an exhibition, a book, a symposium. For him, it was, let's go and build 1 million units, or in Chile is a relatively small country, 100,000 subsidies per year, $2 billion budget in the housing ministry. So relatively small country, there's $2 billion per year spent in a really awful way. And by awful, I mean not just small units or poorly built, mainly because the way money is spent, and it's a property-oriented policy, once you receive the subsidy, you become the owner of your house. It looks more like buying cars than buying houses. All of us, when buying a house, expect to grow its value over time. When you become the owner of a social housing unit, the value goes down. So a $10,000 subsidy becomes a $500 value in the market a couple of years afterwards. So they say, if we want to do better or redefine the notion of quality, let's do something that we would like in our own sense. Design something that gains value over time. So the $2 billion a year in a relatively poor country may be seen as an investment and not just as a social expense. Can design do something here? And then we started to look at numbers. Evidence shows that a middle-class family can live reasonably well in around 80 square meters, 800 square feet. That's pretty much numbers everywhere in the world. Public money can pay for around 30 to 40 square meters. What does the market? Two things, reduce and displace. So the middle-class family squeezed to half because there's not enough money, placed where land costs nothing. I had to say that the subsidy that we accepted to work with, the public policy, was a $10,000 subsidy with which you have to buy the land, provide the infrastructure, and build the house with that amount of money. So you place it where land costs nothing and reduce the size. And the only thing we did was, what if, instead of thinking of 40 square meters as a small house, why don't we consider 40 square meters as half of a good one? Once you reframe the problem as 40 square meters as half of a good house instead of a small one, the key question is, which half do we do? And we thought that with public money, we had to do the half that a family won't be able to do on their own. That's almost the definition of a public policy. And that means that not having enough money and not being responsible for the next half, that it will happen anyhow. It may happen thanks to the design or normally despite the design. So if you are delivering 40 square meter units, people will make them grow anyhow to a reasonable size of 80. So better have that person sitting on the table on day one so that we split tasks. So this whole co-responsibility thing was a consequence, not because we are really a hippie kind of let's think together about the world. We didn't have the money to do that all on our own. Let's have the people that will do that anyhow on the table so that they know in advance what they will have to take care, and then we can explain what we will take care of. And we identified a set of design conditions that belong to the half that families can't do on their own, but that simultaneously are the ones that guarantee a value gain over time, so that this will become a family asset, not just to protect themselves against the environment, but as a tool to overcome poverty.
Yeah. You know, Andres, jump in?
Well, actually, I was going to jump into yesterday. Because what happens is that we had some very good, at least my feeling is that we had some extraordinary introductions yesterday, and we wandered off into a sort of a Harvard seminar. And I'd just like to say a couple of things that actually are relevant to us and how to activate things, which is Kurt gave an extraordinary presentation yesterday about complaint by tying it to the Declaration of Independence. I mean, I was so excited about that I couldn't sleep. But that would not, in fact, have catalyzed the war that liberated the country. There was also a need for provocation. And somebody had to get up in Concord with muskets and kill some British so that they could ship the largest army ever embarked from England to come and be roundly beaten by the Americans. So they didn't negotiate for the next 200 years. And then we got some kind of Canada as a result. With all due respect. But, okay, and I'd like to say that there's a declension here from complaint to provocation, and it should be seen together. And if you don't go from complaint to provocation, you become a kind of parody of yourself, which is what was in the front page of the New York Times this morning, in which the millennials now have a new thing called a microaggression. And if you read it this morning, what happens is that these are kids that are slightly disrespected by implication. You didn't look at me quite straight in the eye because I wasn't good looking enough. Or did you imply I was a little too dark? Is that why you called me beautiful? Because I'm beautiful given how dark I am? That kind of thing. And what happens is if you don't escalate, you actually devolve into a kind of lawyering, which is what happens in this country. And what happens in this country, if you just complain, the lawyers get on it and actually make a field of it, a new field. And you can see how, for example, Toyota just got called in for God knows how many billions of dollars because one carpet was installed backwards in a dealership in California. No one was killed, and they had to recall hundreds of thousands of cars because one carpet, no one was killed, it was done, but somebody got frightened. And now everybody's so frightened that a huge amount of money was wasted that could have been actually approximated the housing budget of Chile on nothing. So there can't be stasis. I think there needs to be a kind of escalation. And I think that we should think of complaint into provocation, if that's the correct word, I don't know, instead of devolution into, just griping. The other thing, which was what Kathy spoke about yesterday, which I thought was actually stunning too, which is like so many of the pieces upstairs, particularly the turn-of-the-century pieces, are in fact complaints about what industry had done to design. It had become kitsch. As soon as the factory got onto making chairs and things, they began imitating handwork in a most kitschy way. And the response that I see upstairs when I go is that the Wiener Werkstätte, Stickley and the Craftsman, Ruskin, etc., they got on with it by actually healing the problem. They didn't get on it by symbolizing the problem. They didn't say, because they said, well, let's set up the craftsman workshops in northern New York. Let's set up a bunch of craftsmen. Let's set up, what they did all over in the 19th century and actually totally reformed design to a very good period. In other words, they were active. They weren't just symbolic protesters. Now, what would happen today? Today, we'd say, well, there's a problem. We will symbolize the kitsch of industry by actually designing really cool shit that is going to be hyper kitsch. And we're going to sell it at Miami, at Art Basel. And I think that art, actually, to take it to what Kathy said yesterday, art has a part to play, which we didn't talk about, really. We spoke about design. Art has a huge part to play, and art has to be understood as actually having two parts. Of course, it engages a problem. Modernism always does. But it either can engage it by symbolizing it or by healing it. And the original modernism of Gropius and company is what we're talking about. There's a problem, we're going to deal with it. And the modernism of now, virtually everywhere in all the magazines, which I don't think anyone here subscribes to, is the modernism of symbolizing what a grotesque situation we're in. And I tell you, we don't need to pay for star architects to tell us that it's screwed up. I can read about it and feel it every day. And so I think that that distinction, and in some ways I have to criticize the Wilsonian, bite the hand that feeds me, because it's like the rest of art today, it is actually getting into the symbolizing of the problem instead of actually the healing of the problem. And what I see upstairs are people healing the problems. By the way, some of them are communists, some of them are fascists, some of them are whatever, but they're dealing with problems in some way instead of just saying it's all screwed up. And anyway, that was perhaps tying what we're saying back to yesterday.
And I appreciate that, and I want to get Kurt back into the conversation now. But I do have one final point, Kurt, before you let these panelists go. So why don't you jump in, and then we'll ask them a question about
one
Miami
thing
before.
that struck me that was the kind of extraordinary consensus among the four of them. And I don't think that's simply because the deck was stacked for consensus. But the other thing that struck me, certainly in the American context of politics and the political economy, is what is being complained about and talked about as the solutions doesn't fall cleanly along the right-left lines in the United States. I mean, when we say, oh, bureaucracy, it's killing us, regulations are killing us, well, that's essentially a Republican critique of the Democratic bigger is better government. But of course, the full free market solution of, oh no, government should get out of the way completely. There should be no templates. There should be no social housing. There should be. So I'm curious, is this consensus about how we ought to be building and rebuilding cities and building social housing and creating transportation that works? How does that, is it an opportunity for bipartisanship, or is it going to be killed because the left will hate it because you're anti-regulation, and killed by the right because they'll hate it because you're talking about spending government money?
Actually, if I may just think, this is a question I wanted to ask you. I remember back in the 60s and early 70s that the left was the one that was against government oppression. Briefly, but it was. It was about increasing human and personal freedom of gender, of sexual, whatever, in every way. And somehow we find ourselves looking back, and now it's essentially the agenda of the libertarians that do that. And I wonder, when did that happen? That this idea of personal freedom, which is what we thrived on in the 60s, became captured, depends on your point of view, from the right. And I don't know how it happened. I know it happened slowly. But how did that happen?
Well, I have a theory that it was basically a grand bargain. Yes, you can be gay and you can smoke dope, and I can make all the money I want and not have to pay taxes on it. It was a kind of libertarian grand bargain between the left and the right. It is interesting because the co-responsibility of poor people finishing their houses, or I don't want this niggling. Slowing down development regulation. Those are, that sounds like, a way in which, I don't know if it's neoliberal or sane Republican, sane right, but is there a way, do you guys face, does the left and the right, do the left and the right line up in any predictable way to support you or to be against you?
I think we're changing, or we should change from a behavior of distrust to a behavior of trust. I'll give you an example. I'm part of the board of the World Resources Institute. Recently, they launched a global forest watch. It's incredible how they can monitor if you're in your building or if in your area you're changing something. They can they can see. What I'm trying to say is we have to move to a more monitorized. I don't have to ask to brief. I don't have to ask. There are some behaviors that you know it's important. For instance, a good to sustainability is just an equation, what you save and what you waste. So you can monitor this. You can monitor water supply. So it's changing from having to ask to having the responsibility to know what is your responsibility in this context. So more and more, I hope we could achieve to a moment where in every important issue of our life, we have the liberty, because we know that it could be monitorized, and you can participate, you can understand why is this important. So it's not having to ask to some bureaucracy, should I build? You know, buildings. There are so many complications, the size of the windows, the steps. Everyone knows what is necessary. We don't have to have a guy who is looking, oh, your step is 16 centimeters, it should be that and that. So, and there's other issues. Due to this instrument, you have the power to organize to organize complaints. But we still, to give the answers to this complaint, we're still at the Stone Age. And that gives a lot of anger, since more and more I've seen in Brazil or many countries, every problem is becoming a Plaza Tahrir Square. You can organize that. But the problem is you cannot answer, and I think it's a balance that between monitorizing my feeling, and I'm very happy that the World Resources Institute, they are doing a very serious work in many issues, many issues.
And Gabe, you worked for a Democratic city and a Democratic mayor, now in the capital, which is, although run by Congress and the government, a highly democratic city. How do these issues fall on the established political template?
Well, the political.
No, I'm asking Gabe here.
So there's, first of all, the power is shifting to the local level as cities are reurbanizing. And so I worked for two guys that were, liberal socially, but they took on the unions and the bureaucracies, and one of them lost because of it. We'll see about the other one. I think he'll be successful, but the mayors are the most accountable to the people. And so I think that they're disregarding sort of the old Republican, Democrat labels, and they have to save their cities, either financially or they have to move them forward, save the educational systems. They have to create an environment that people want to live in. And so I think that they're focused on sort of impact over all else and innovation, because they're also in a very competitive environment with other mayors and other jurisdictions and other cities. So I'm trying to figure out a way to sort of tie this back. But the complaints, particularly by younger people or people living in the cities, they are demanding change at a rate that the government can't typically come up with, which is why the federal government is not even really a player anymore, except to provide money in a very funky kind of way. So I think this is the most exciting time since the turn of the last century, particularly for transportation, urban planning, and the people, the public, are way ahead of the public officials, and they're demanding things that we're not used to doing. And in some cases, we need to get out of the way, or we need to work with them. But the public-private partnership is the future, the blurring of the lines between government and private, which is scary for people, right? But it's also the key. The blurring of the political parties, the blurring of everything, and technology is enabling that. And I think that if we embrace it, we have this huge chance to be successful, and if we fight it, you're going to be under the bus or on the back of the bus. You're not going to be driving the bus. And from a public policy standpoint, we need to embrace it because the rate of change is so exponential versus linear now. And people are like, I'm used to a linear rate of change in government, and they're just getting left behind.
I think, yeah, we have time for a couple of questions, and we have a question right here.
Two quick questions. Just, I can't help but know we're talking about cities changing quickly. I just can't help but notice, as a Miami resident, we're in a place, it's hard to imagine a North American city that's changed more in the past 10 years than this place. Nearly 100% downtown population growth. The stories of people taking mass transit to work continue to grow by the day, which is hard to believe for many of us who live here, I think. But I must say, on a weekly basis, the stories are gone. And of course, we have now perhaps one of the more interesting privately financed transit projects in the country that's being planned out right now, connecting up downtown Miami all the way up to Orlando. So just for some context, I was struck by, as we're talking about change, in Miami we're actually seeing some very dramatic change. Two questions. One, Andres, for what is, you mentioned Detroit, but obviously they're in bankruptcy. Other than Detroit, can you sort of talk about a city in the world that sort of gets it right in terms of sort of good sort of regulatory controls, but also giving that freedom for the storekeeper, the small developer to do what they need to do? And then secondly, Gabe, if you could just continue, as the cost to create continue to go down, we're seeing these startup communities, around the world. And they're increasingly focused on transit, right? And whether, the most obvious examples like Uber and Lyft and stuff. Talk a little, you were getting into it there a minute ago, but talk more about this. I mean, should governments be focused on sort of opening up data for entrepreneurs to be working on around transit and coming up with solutions, and less on sort of large publicly financed transit projects, or what's the balance?
Well, cities are all in different generations. And for example, if you look at the left bank of Paris, what was called the Latin Quarter in 1870, it had no value. And the artists came in and they burrowed and they made it cool. And then eventually the developers came in, and Haussmann came in and made it valuable. And the same thing happened in Greenwich Village and in Soho and in Miami Beach and in Key West and in Coconut Grove in Miami and now in Wynwood, etc. Always the cool people come in. They don't have means, but they're unmonitored. The city doesn't pay attention to a place that has low value because there are no neighbors complaining. And people with a good eye come in and make it cool. And then what happens is that a second generation comes in that does things properly. The developers who hire the architects and consultants to get the permits, and they get proper mortgages. And just think of all the places I mentioned, from Soho to Greenwich Village to Miami Beach. And it gentrifies, and eventually, as they say in New York, come the dentists from New Jersey and ruin it. And then people have to move on to Brooklyn, and they start again. What has happened is that regulation in the last 30 years has become so pervasive that every bit is now supervised. And unless you're in crisis, absolute crisis like Detroit, that first generation of people who explore, who inhabit, don't exist. And so what has had to arise is an innovation, which is the public-private partnership. A public-private partnership is when you want a developer to do something properly with the permits and the fire codes and all that apparatus, but the market isn't there yet. There's a difference between what it costs to renovate the city and what you can get for it. And that has coincided exactly. The private-public partnership is relatively new, and it has coincided with when regulation became pervasive. And if we were to go back, and what's happened in Detroit is that they can't afford regulation. So they've gone back to circa 1970. And so the kids are coming in doing this stuff, and as soon as they get money, you watch it. The regulator's gonna be out again, and everybody's gonna need a public-private partnership. But that triple stage has actually been absolutely, and we have this very expensive system now in which every single developer needs a subsidy because the people who organically discover and develop our city have been eliminated by regulation.
So right now, we're actually at a point where there actually aren't any models that we can move to. Is that right?
Well, there are plenty of poor little
DC.
towns in America.
Washington DC.
Yeah.
But the actual city, not the government.
The actual city, no, actually, I think the next frontier are the medium and small towns of America.
Mhm.
They have fantastic real estate. Well, you see them up the Hudson. Fantastic real estate, virtually no regulators, and that's the place to act. That's where you can open a restaurant without a grease trap, you know, all that. Now later when you want to sell it, sell it to Wall Street, you have to get a grease trap. But you begin at a certain place. We're all talking about sequential design here. You begin at something, you start with something, and then eventually when you have the means, you perfect it. And that's,
So, it's a really interesting question, and over dinner last night, I had a very interesting conversation with somebody, and there's a bit of an age divide here. There's a bit of fear of what's going to happen with technology, like the autonomous car, and are we just going to have cars proliferating everywhere, which is a valid question. But the reality is that technology is the great equalizer. You know, there are African American folks in DC and Southeast that cannot get a taxi, because it won't stop for them. It won't stop for them in Northwest, but the Uber will come, right? And so the cost of energy is going to fall. Well, like solar's fallen, 85% over the last 20 years. Energy is going to be essentially free in 20 years. That's going to change everything. It's going to change everything. Yes, jobs will go away, but people may actually be doing other things with their lives. So there's all these sort of existential questions, but then when you get down to the practical stuff, the government is going to become less and less important, except the public policy aspect is important. So when the autonomous car comes, right, yeah, we could have a bunch of SUVs rolling around with nobody in them, full of groceries, you know, and you could just send your SUV. But that's probably not how it's going to play out if responsible. What will probably happen is, and this is just a theory, but it'll be more like PRT, which is this sort of pie-in-the-sky idea that you can have personal rapid transit, right? And it's on, like, tracks, though, right? It's on tracks. Well, it could play out that actually there's hundreds of these little vehicles on Washington Ave that Jaime was talking about, and they're all running 2 feet apart from each other, right? And they have 1 or 2 people in them, and they're running off of solar, and people can get where they need to go. But it depends on, do we set the public policy so that that's what is created or not? So, you know, I think the future is fascinating, but this woman I was arguing with last night, and friendly argument, she was like, yeah, but the bus is what supports poor communities. I'm like, yeah, but the bus needs an 80% subsidy in a lot of places. And the service sucks in most places, and it doesn't take you where you want to go.
and
So
by
if
the
we
way,
have
don't forget that the most profitable car company right now is Porsche,
Yeah,
not Tata.
right, exactly.
So there's a huge counterculture of people actually who want the freedom and who want the pleasure of driving. So
But
it's not
that's-
just the bus, there's the third pole, there's the bus, that,
Right.
and then the Porsche.
And those people may drive on racetracks, but I'm convinced that in 40 years, you look back and be like, I can't believe that
You're
people
gonna have
drive
such a
cars.
right-wing backlash with that,
No, no,
that
no.
presentation.
I
You just
disagree.
politicized it immediately.
No. Because it'll
No,
start
because
in
you send me to
cities.
the racetrack, you can say you can have your Porsche, that's the answer.
Well, you could drive on the Autobahn, which is fine with me, but not in my city doing 50 miles an hour down Washington Ave,
Excuse me, Tony.
or Collins Ave, or wherever we
I-
are, to Washington.
I have heard a very important thing from a Chinese professor from Taiwan. And I asked him, what you're providing for moving? We want to provide to each citizen a BMW. What is BMW? Bus, metro, walking.
But that's the great irony, is that the autonomous car will mean the collapse of the car industry, which will mean the rise of walking and biking, and what you
Bus.
are a big proponent of. Actually, I think the bus is going to die, but that's a whole other issue. I think the heavy rail system will be the backbone. You'll have arterial bus, but the local bus system will die, and that's fine. It's fine.
Why would self-driving autonomous cars be slots of the car industry? Why wouldn't those be Fords and
Sure.
Chevys?
Well, because right now cars sit 94.8% of the time on average. Zip cars sit 70% of the time. Car2Go sits about 60% of the time. The estimates for the autonomous cars, just out at Google actually talking to them, is that it'll be active 95% of the time. Now that means that this inherently lazy asset that sits on its ass all the time is going to suddenly be busy. And if it's busy and the utilization is that high, that means you need about 70% fewer cars.
So you're not talking about just the technology, but an effective car sharing system.
Well, yeah, you'll just put your beacon up when you walk out of here and
Right.
say, I need to go from here to there. And a vehicle will pick you up.
Right.
And that's a wonderful thing. There's nothing to be scared of. You may
Unless
not need
unless
the
you're
local
Ford
bus.
or the taxi industry. Yeah.
Well, then the taxi industry, car sharing, ride sharing is all going to become one thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I wouldn't invest in a lot of those businesses necessarily, but that's up to you.
If we have time for one more quick question, trying to split the difference between time. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so I actually work for the local government, and I believe your name is Gabe. You have said it beautifully, and it
Thank
really caught my attention because you go into government and you're like, I'm going to help the average citizen. But then you're there and you realize that shit does not get done. And I, along with like friends of mine, and we're just like average people who are sick of it. And you're right. I mean, there is this linear form of doing things, and it's obviously not working. So you're right. People are forming, and they're holding people accountable, and they want change. So.
And they're bypassing the government.
Particularly
Thank
here.
you all. We could go on. And we are going to go on, but shift the subject slightly.